Special Kind of Morning by Gardner R. Dozois, originally published in the 1971 first edition of New Dimensions, a series of anthologies edited by Robert Silverberg, republished in 1974 in another anthology edited by Silverberg, this one called Alpha 5, and again in a collection of the author's stories in 1977 entitled The Visible Man. It appeared in yet another anthology in 1979, The Best of New Dimensions. As Robert Silverberg notes in the introduction to the latter, quote, "It was a Hugo and Nebula nominee and belongs in all sorts of best anthologies." End quote. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. A Special Kind of Morning. Did you ever hear the one about the old man and the sea? Halt a minute, lordling. Stop and listen. It's a fine story, full of balance and point and social pith, short and direct. It's not mine. Mine are long and rambling and parenthetical, and they corrode the moral fiber right out of a man. Come to think, I won't tell you that one after all. A man of my age has a right to prefer his own material, and let the critics be damned. I've a prejudice now for webs of my own weaving. Sit down, sit down. Butt against pavement. Yes, it's been done before. Everything has, near about. Now, that's not an expression of your black pessimism or your futility or what have you. Pessimism's just the common-sense knowledge that there's more ways for something to go wrong than for it to go right, from our point of view anyway, which is not necessarily that of the management or of the mechanism, if you prefer your cosmos depersonalized. As for futility, everybody dies the true death eventually. Even though executives may dodge it for a few hundred years, the whole gets them all in the end, and I imagine that's futility enough for a start. The philosophical man accepts both as constants and then doesn't let them bother him any. Sit down, damn it. Don't pretend you've important business to be about. Young devil, you are in the enviable position of having absolutely nothing to do because it's going to take you a while to recover from what you've just done. There, that's better. Comfortable? You don't look it. You look like you've just sat in a puddle of piss and are wondering what the socially appropriate reaction is. Hypocrisy's an art, boy. You'll improve with age. Now you're bemused, lordling, that you let an old soak chivvy you around, and now he's making fun of you. Well, the expression on your face is worth a chuckle. If you could see it, you'd laugh yourself. You will see it in years from now, too, on some other young man's face. That's the only kind of mirror that ever shows it clear, and you'll be an old soak by that time, and you'll laugh and insult the young buck's dignity, but you'll be laughing more at the reflection of the man you used to be than at that particular stud himself. And you'll probably have to tell the buck just what I've told you to cool him down. And there's a laugh in that, too. Listen for the echo of 1,000,001 laughs behind you. I hear 1,000,000 now. How do I get away with such insolence? What have I got to lose, for one thing? That gives you a certain perspective, and I'm socially instructive in spite of myself. I'm valuable as an object lesson. For that matter, why is an arrogant young aristo like you sitting there and putting up with my guff? Don't even bother to answer. I knew the minute you came whistling down the street full of steam and strut. Nobody gets up this early in the morning anymore unless they're old as I am and begrudge sleep's dry run of death, or unless they've never been to bed in the first place. The world's your friend this morning, a toy for you to play with and examine and stuff in your mouth to taste, and you're letting your benevolence slop over onto the old degenerate you've met on the street. You're even happy enough to listen, though you're being quizzical about it, and you're sitting over there feeling benignly superior, and I'm sitting over here feeling benignly superior. A nice arrangement, and everyone content. Well then, mornings make you feel that way, especially if you're fresh from a night at the towers, the musk of Lady Knee still warm on your flesh. A blush. My buck, you are new hatched. How did I know? Boy, you'd be surprised what I know. I'm occasionally startled myself, and I've been working longer to get it cataloged. Besides, hindsight is a comfortable substitute for omnipotence, and I'm not blind yet. You have the unmistakable look of a cub who's just found out he can do something else with it besides piss. An incredible revelation, as I recall. The blazing significance of it will wear little with the years, though not all that much, I suppose, until you get down to the brink of the ultimate cold, when you stop worrying about the identity of warmth, or demanding that it pay toll in pleasure. Any hand of clay, long's the blood still runs the tiny degree that's just enough for difference. Warmth's the only definition between you and graveyard dirt. But mourning's not for graveyards, though it works the other way. Did you know they also used to use that to make babies? 'S fact, though few know it now. It's a versatile beast. Oh, come. Buck, cub, young clocksman, stop being so damn surprised. People ate, slept, and fornicated before you were born. Some of them, anyway, and a few will probably even find the courage to keep on at it after you die. You don't have to keep it secret. The thing's been circulated in this region once or twice before. You weren't the first to learn how to make the beast do its trick, though I know you don't believe that. I don't believe it concerning myself, and I've had a long time to learn. You make me think, sitting there innocent as an egg and twice as vulnerable. Yes, you are definitely about to make me think, and I believe I'll have to think of some things I always regret having thought about, just to keep me from growing maudlin. Damn it, boy, you do make me think. Life's strange. Wet-eared as you are, you've probably had that thought a dozen times already, probably had it this morning as you tumbled out of your fragrant bed to meet the rim of the sun. Well, I'm 4 times your age, and have a ream more experience, and I still can't think of anything better to sum up the world. Life's strange. It's been said, yes. But think, boy, how strange. The two of us talking, you coming, me going, me knowing where you've got to go, you suspecting where I've been, and the same destination for both. Oh, strange, very strange. Damn it, you're a deader already if you can't see the strangeness of that, if you can't sniff the poetry. It reeks of it as of blood, and I've smelt blood, Buck. It has a very distinct odor. You know it when you smell it. You're bound for blood and passion and high deeds and all the rest of the business, and maybe for a little understanding if you're lucky and have eyes to see. Me, I'm bound for nothing, literally. I've come to rest here in Kos, and while the red lady spins her web of colors across the sky, I sit and weave my own webs of words and dreams and other spider stuff. What? Yes, I do talk too much. Old men like to babble, and philosophy's a cushion for old bones. But it's my profession now, isn't it? And I've promised you a story. What happened to my leg? That's a bloody story, but I said you're bound for blood. I know the mark. I'll tell it to you then. Perhaps it'll help you to understand when you reach the narrow place. Perhaps it'll even help you to think, although that's a horrible weight to wish on any man. It's customary to notarize my card before I start, keep you from running off at the end without paying. Thank you, young sir. Beware of some of these beggars, Buck. They have a credit tally at Central greater than either of us will ever run up. They turn a tidy profit out of poverty. I'm an honest pauper, more's the pity, exist mostly on the subsidy, if you call that existing. Yes, I know, the leg. We'll have to go back to the realignment for that, more than half a century ago and half a sector away, at World. This was before World was a member of the Commonwealth. In fact, that's what the realignment was about, the old Combine overthrown by the Quaestors, who then opted for amalgamation and forced world into the Commonwealth. That's where and when the story starts. Start it with waiting. A lot of things start like that, waiting. And when the thing you're waiting for is probable death, and you're lying there loving life and suddenly noticing how pretty everything is and listening to the flit hooves of darkness click closer, feeling the iron-shod boots strike relentless sparks from the surface of your mind, knowing that death is about to fall out of the sky and that there's no way to twist out from under, then waiting can take time. Minutes become hours, hours become unthinkable horrors. Add enough horrors together, total the scaly snouts, and you've got a day and a half I once spent laying up in a mountain valley in the Blackfriars on World, almost the last day I ever spent anywhere. This was just a few hours after Dakota. Everything was a mess. Nobody really knew what was happening. Everybody's communication lines cut. I was just a buck myself then, working with the Quaestors in the field, a hunted criminal. Nobody knew what the Combine would do next. We didn't know what we'd do next. Groups surging wildly from one place to another at random, panic and riots all over the planet, even in the controlled environments. And Dakota on the Blackfriars was indescribable, a 70-mile swath of smoking insanity, capped by boiling umbrellas of smoke that eddied ashes from the ground to the stratosphere and back. At night, it pulsed with molten scum, ugly as a lanced blister, lighting up the cloud cover across the entire horizon, visible for hundreds of miles. It was this ugly glow that finally panicked even the zombies in the environments, probably the first strong emotion in their lives. It had been hard to sum up the effects of the battle. We thought that we had the edge, that the Combine was close to breaking, but nobody knew for sure. If they weren't as close to folding as we thought, then we were probably finished. The Quaestors had exhausted most of their hoarded resources at Dakota, and we certainly couldn't hit the Combine any harder. If they could shrug off the blow, then they could wear us down. Personally, I didn't see how anything could shrug that off. I'd watched it all, and it had shaken me considerably. There's an old-time expression, put the fear of God into him. That's what Dakota had done for me. There wasn't any God anymore, but I'd seen fire vomit from the heavens and the earth ripped wide for rape, and it had been an impressive enough surrogate. Few people ever realized how close the Combine and the Quaestors had come to destroying world between them, there at Dakota. We'd crouched that night, the team and I, on the high stone ramparts of the tallest of the Blackfriars, hopefully far away from anything that could fall on us. There were 20 miles of low, gnarly foothills between us and the rolling savanna land where the city of Dakota had been minutes before, but the ground under our bellies heaved and quivered like a sick animal, and the rock was hot to the touch, feverish. We could have gotten farther away, should have gotten farther away, but we had to watch. That had been decided without anyone saying a word, without any question about it. It was impossible not to watch. It never even occurred to any of us to take another safer course of action. When reality is being turned inside out like a dirty sock, you watch, or you are less than human. So we watched it all from beginning to end. 2 hours that became a single second lasting for eons. Like a still photograph of time twisted into a scream. The scream reverberating on forever and yet taking no duration at all to experience. We didn't talk. We couldn't talk. The molecules of the air itself shrieked too loudly, and the deep roar of explosions was a continual drum roll, but we wouldn't have talked even if we'd been able. You don't speak in the presence of an angry God. Sometimes we'd look briefly at each other. Our faces were all nearly identical, ashen, waxy, eyes of glass, blank, and lost as pale driftwood stranded on a beach by the tide. We'd been driven through the gamut of expressions into extremis rictus, faces so contorted and strained they ached, and beyond to the quietus of shock. Muscles too slack and flaccid to respond anymore. We'd only look at each other for a second, hardly focusing, almost not aware of what we were seeing, and then our eyes would be dragged back as if by magnetism to the fire. At the beginning, we'd clutched each other, but as the battle progressed, we slowly drew apart, huddling into individual agony, the thing so big that human warmth meant nothing, so frightening that the instinct to gather together for protection was reversed, and the presence of others only intensified the realization of how ultimately naked you were. Earlier, we'd set up a scatter shield to filter the worst of the hard radiation, the gamma and intense infrared and ultraviolet, blunt some of the heat and shock and noise. We thought we had a fair chance of surviving then, but we couldn't have run anyway. We were fixed by the beauty of horror, horror of beauty, surely as if by a spike driven through our backbones into the rock. And away over the foothills, God danced in anger, and his feet struck the ground to ash. What was it like? Kos still has oceans and storms. Did you ever watch the sea lashed by high winds? The storm boils the water into froth, whips it white, until it becomes an ocean of ragged lace to the horizon, whirlpools of milk, not a fleck of blue left alive. The land looked like this at Dakota. The hills moved. The quaestors had a discontinuity projector there, and under its lash the ground stirred like sluggish batter under a baker's spoon. Stirred, shuddered, groaned, cracked, broke. Acres heaved themselves into new mountains. Other acres collapsed into canyons. Imagine a giant asleep just under the surface of the earth, overgrown by fields, dreaming dreams of rock and crystal. Imagine him moving restlessly, the long rhythm of his dreams touched by nightmare, tossing, moaning, tremors signaling unease in waves up and down his miles-long frame. Imagine him catapulted into waking terror, lurching suddenly to his knees with the bawling roar of 10 million burning calves, a steaming claw of rock and black earth raking for the sky. Now, in a wink, imagine the adjacent land hurtling downward, sinking like a rock in a pond, opening a womb 1,000 feet wide, swallowing everything and grinding it to powder. Then, almost too quick to see, imagine the mountain and the crater switching, the mountain collapsing all at once and washing the feet of the older Blackfriars with a tidal wave of earth, then tumbling down to make a pit. At the same time, the sinking earth at the bottom of the other crater reversing itself and erupting upward into a quaking fist of rubble. Then they switch again and keep switching, like watching the same film clip continuously run forward and backward. Now multiply that by 1,000,000 and spread it out so that all you can see to the horizon is a stew of humping rock. Did you visualize it? Not a tenth of it. Dervishes of fire stalked the chaos, melting into each other, whirlpooling. Occasionally, a tactical nuclear explosion would punch a hole in the night, a brief, intense flare that would be swallowed like a candle in a murky snowstorm. Once a tac nuke detonation coincided with the upthrusting of a rubble mountain, with an effect like that of a firecracker exploding inside a swinging sack of grain. The city itself was gone. We could no longer see a trace of anything man-made, only the stone maelstrom. The river Delva had also vanished, flash-boiled to a steam. For a while we could see the gorge of its dry beds stitching across the plain, but then the ground heaved up and obliterated it. It was unbelievable that anything could be left alive down there, very little was. Only the remainder of the heavy weapons sections on both sides continued to survive, invisible to us in the confusion. Still protected by powerful phase walls and scatter shields, they pounded blindly at each other, the Combine somewhat ineffectively with biodeaths and tac nukes, the Quaestors responding by stepping up the discontinuity projector. There was only one in the command module. The Quaestor technicians were praying it wouldn't be wiped out by a random strike, and it was a terraforming device and not actually a weapon at all, but the Combine had been completely unprepared for it, and were suffering horribly as a result. Everything began to flicker, random swatches of savanna land shimmering and blurring, phasing in and out of focus in a jerky, mismatched manner, that film strip run through a spastic projector. At first we thought it must be heat eddies caused by the fires, but then the flickering increased drastically in frequency and tempo, speeding up until it was impossible to keep anything in focus, even for a second, turning the wide veldt into a mad kaleidoscope of writhing, interchanging shapes and color patterns from one horizon to the other. It was impossible to watch it for long. It hurt the eyes and filled us with an oily, inexplicable panic that we were never able to verbalize. We looked away, filled with the musty surgings of vague fear. We didn't know then that we were watching the first practical application of a process that had long been suppressed by both the Combine and the Commonwealth, a process based on the Starship dimensional drive, which isn't a drive at all, but the words passed into the common press, that enables a high-cycling discontinuity projector to throw time out of phase within a limited area, so that a spot here would be a couple of minutes ahead or behind a spot a few inches away in continuity sequence. That explanation would give a psychophysicist fits, since time is really nothing at all like the way we experience it, so the process really doesn't do what I've said it does, doing something abstruse instead. But that's close enough to what it does on a practical level. 'Cause even if the time distortion is an illusionary effect, like the sun seeming to rise and set, they still used it to kill people. So it threw time out of phase, and kept doing it, switching the dislocation at random so that in any given square foot of land there might be 4 or 5 discrepancies in time sequence that kept interchanging. Like here might be 1 minute ahead of the base now, and then a second later, language breaks down hopelessly under this stuff. You need the math. Here would be 2 minutes behind the now, then 5 minutes behind, then 3 ahead, and so on. And all the adjacent zones in that square foot are going through the same switching process at the same time. God damn this language. The Combine's machinery tore itself to pieces. So did the people. Some died of suffocation because of a 5-minute discrepancy between an inhaled breath and oxygen received by the lungs. Some drowned in their own blood. It took about 10 minutes, at least as far as we were concerned as unaffected observers. I had a psychophysicist tell me once that it had both continued to happen forever and had never happened at all, and that neither statement canceled out the validity of the other, that each statement in fact was both applicable and non-applicable to the same situation consecutively, and I did not understand. It took 10 minutes. At the end of that time, the world got very still. We looked up. The land had stopped churning. A tiny star appeared amongst the rubble in the middle distance, small as a pinhead, but incredibly bright and clear. It seemed to suck the night into it like a vortex, as if it were a pinprick through the world stuff into a more intense reality, as if it were gathering a great breath for a shout. We buried our heads in our arms as one, instinctively. There was a very bright light, a light that we could feel through the tops of our heads, a light that left dazzling after images, even through closed and shrouded lids. The mountain leaped under us, bounced us into the air again and again, battered us into near unconsciousness. We never even heard the roar. After a while, things got quiet again, except for a continuous low rumbling. When we looked up, there were thick, sluggish tongues of molten magma oozing up in vast flows across the veldt, punctuated here and there by spectacular shower fountains of vomited sparks. Our scatter shield had taken the brunt of the blast, borne it just long enough to save our lives, and then overloaded and burnt itself to scrap. One of the first times that's ever happened. Nobody said anything. We didn't look at each other. We just lay there. The chrono said an hour went by, but nobody was aware of it. Finally, a couple of us got up in silence and started to stumble aimlessly back and forth. One by one, the rest crawled to their feet. Still in silence, still trying not to look at each other, we automatically cleaned ourselves up. You hear someone say, "It made me shit my pants," and you think it's an expression, not under the right stimuli. Automatically, we treated our bruises and lacerations. Automatically, we tidied the camp up, buried the ruined scatterfield generator. Automatically, we sat down again and stared numbly at the light show on the savannah. Each of us knew the war was over. We knew it with the gut rather than the head. It was an emotional reaction, but very calm, very resigned, very passive. It was a thing too big for questioning. It became a self-evident fact. After Dakota, there could be nothing else. Period. The war was over. We were almost right, but not quite. In another hour or so, a man from Field HQ came up over the mountain shoulder in a stolen vac form and landed in camp. The man switched off the vac, jumped down, took 2 steps toward the parapet overlooking hell, stopped. We saw his stomach muscles jump, tighten. He took a stumbling half-step back, then stopped again. His hand went up to shield his throat, dropped, hesitated, went back up. We said nothing. The HQ directing the Dakota campaign had been sensibly located behind the Blackfriars. They had been shielded by the mountain chain and had seen nothing but glare against the cloud cover. This was his first look at the city, at where the city had been. I watched the muscles play in his back, saw his shoulders hunch as if under an upraised fist. A good many of the Quaestor men involved in planning the Dakota operation committed suicide immediately after the realignment. A good many didn't. I don't know what category this one belonged in. The liaison man finally turned his head, dragged himself away. His movements were jerky and his face was an odd color, but he was under control. He pulled Hyneth, our team leader, aside. They talked for a half hour. The liaison man showed Hyneth a map. Scribbled on a pad for Hyneth to see, gave Hyneth some papers. Hyneth nodded occasionally. The liaison man said goodbye, half ran to his vac form. The vac lifted with an erratic surge, steadied, then disappeared in a long arc over the gnarled backs of the Blackfriars. Hyneth stood in the dirt swirl kicked up by the backwash and watched impassively. It got quiet again, but it was a little more apprehensive. Hyneth came over, studied us for a while, then told us to get ready to move out. We stared at him. He repeated it in a quiet, firm voice, unendurably patient. Hush for a second, then somebody groaned. Somebody else cursed, and the spell of Dakota was partially broken for the moment. We woke enough to ready our gear. There was even a little talking, though not much. Hyneth appeared at our head and led us out in a loose travel formation, diagonally across the face of the slope, then up toward the shoulder. We reached the notch we'd found earlier and started down the other side. Everyone wanted to look back at Dakota. No one did. Somehow, it was still night. We never talked much on the march, of course, but tonight the silence was spooky. You could hear boots crunch on stone, the slight rasp of breath, the muted jangle of knives occasionally bumping against thighs. You could hear our fear. You could smell it. You could see it. We could touch it. We could taste it. I was a member of something so old that they even had to dig up the name for it when they were rooting through the rubble of ancient history, looking for concepts to use against the Combine. A commando team. Don't ask me what it means, but that's what it's called. Come to think, I know what it means in terms of flesh. It means ugly. Long, ugly days and nights that come back in your sleep even uglier, so that you don't want to think about it at all, because it squeezes your eyeballs like a vice. Cold and dark and wet, with sudden death looming up out of nothing at any time and jarring you with mortality like a rubber glove full of ice water slapped across your face. Living jittery high all the time, so that everything gets so real that it looks fake. You live in an anticipation that's pain, like straddling a fence with a knife blade for a top rung, waiting for something to come along in the dark and push you off. You get so you like it. The pain's so consistent that you forget it's there. You forget there ever was a time when you didn't have it, and you live on the adrenaline. We liked it. We were dedicated. We hated. It gave us something to do with our hate, something tangible we could see, and nobody'd done it but us for hundreds of years. There was an exultation to that. The scholars and antiquarians who'd started the Quaestor movement left full sentient and relatively unwatched, so they could better piece together the muddle of prehistory from generations of inherited archives. They'd been smart. They knew their only hope of baffling the Combine was to hit them with radical concepts and tactics, things they didn't have instructions for handling, things out of the Combine's experience. So they scooped concepts out of prehistory, as far back as the archives go, even finding written records somewhere and having to figure out how to use them. Out of one of these things, they got the idea of guerrilla war. No, I don't know what that means either, but what it means is playing the game by your own rules instead of the enemy's. Oh, you let the enemy keep playing by his rules, see, but you play by your own. Gives you a wider range of moves. You do things, I mean ridiculous things, but so ancient they don't have any defense against it because they never thought they'd have to defend against that. Most of the time, they never even knew that existed. Like, we used to run around with these projectile weapons they'd copied from old plans and mass-produced in the Autfax on the sly by stealing computer time. The things worked by a chemical reaction inside the mechanism that would spit these tiny missiles out at high velocity. The missile would hit you so hard it would actually lodge itself in your body, puncture internal organs, kill you. I know it sounds like an absurd concept, but there were advantages. Don't forget how tightly controlled the society of the Combines was. Even worse than the Commonwealth in its own way. We couldn't just steal energy weapons or biodeaths and use them because all those things operated on broadcast power from the Combine, and as soon as one was reported missing, the Combine would just cut the relay for that particular code. We couldn't make them ourselves because unless you used the Combine's broadcast power, you'd need a ton of generator equipment with each weapon to provide enough energy to operate it, and we didn't have the technology to miniaturize that much machinery. Later, some genius figured out a way to make, say, a functioning biodeath with everything but the energy source and then cut into and tap Combine broadcast power without showing up on the coding board, but that was toward the end anyway, and most of them were stockpiled for the shock troops at Dakota. At least the guns worked. And there were even unexpected advantages. We found that tangle fields, scatter shields, phase walls, personal warders, all the usual defenses, were unable to stop the bullets, the little missiles fired by the guns. They were just too sophisticated to stop anything as crude as a lump of metal moving at relatively sluggish ballistic speeds. Same with bombs and grenades, devices designed to have a chemical reaction violent enough to kill in an enclosed place. And the list went on and on. The Combine thought we couldn't move around because all vehicles were coded and worked on broadcast power. Did you ever hear of bicycles? They're devices for translating mechanical energy into motion. They ride on wheels that you actually make revolve with physical labor. And the bicycles didn't have enough metal mass to trigger sentry fields or show up on sweep probes, so we could go undetected to places they thought nobody could reach. Communicate? We used mirrors to flash messages, used puffs of smoke as code, had people actually carry messages from one place to another. More important, we personalized war. That was the most radical thing. That was the thing that turned us from kids running around and having fun breaking things into men with bitter faces. That was the thing that took heart out of the Combine more than anything else. That's why people still talk about the realignment with horror today, even after all these years, especially in the Commonwealth. We killed people. We did it ourselves. We walked up and stabbed them. I mentioned a knife before, boy, and I knew you didn't know what it was. You bluff well for a kid. That's the way to a reputation for wisdom. Look sage and always keep your mouth shut about your ignorance. Well, a knife is a tapering piece of metal with a handle, sharpened on the sides and very sharp at the tapered end, sharp enough so that when you strike someone with it, the metal goes right into their flesh, cuts them, rips them open, kills them. And there is blood on your hands, which feels wet and sticky and is hard to wash off because it dries and sticks to the little hairs on the backs of your wrists. We learned how to hit people hard enough to kill them, snap the bones inside the skin like dry sticks inside oiled cloth. We did. We strangled them with lengths of wire. You're shocked. So was the Combine. They had grown used to killing at a great distance, the push of a button, the flick of a switch, using vast, clean, impersonal forces to do their annihilation. We killed people. We killed people, not statistics and abstractions. We heard their screams. We saw their faces. We smelled their blood and their vomit and shit and urine when their systems let go after death. You have to be crazy to do things like that. We were crazy. We were a good team. There were 12 of us in the group, although we mostly worked in sections of 4. I was in the team leaders section, and it had been my family for more than 2 years. Hyneth, stocky, balding, leather-faced, a hard, fair man, brilliant organizer. Wren, impassive, withdrawn, taciturn, frighteningly competent, of a strange humor. Goth, young, tireless, bullheaded, given to sudden enthusiasms and depressions. He'd only been with us for about 4 months, a replacement for Mason, who had been killed while trying to escape from a raid on Cape Ithaca. And me. We were all warped men, emotional cripples one way or the other. We were all crazy. The Combine could never understand that kind of craziness, in spite of the millions of people they'd killed or shriveled impersonally over the years. They were afraid of that craziness. They were baffled by it, never could plan to counter it or take it into account. They couldn't really believe it. That's how we'd taken the Blackfriars transmitter hours before Dakota. It had been impregnable, wrapped in layer after layer of defense fields against missile attack by chemical or biological agents, transmitted energy, almost anything. We'd walk in. They'd never imagine anyone would do that. that it was even possible to attack that way, so there was no defense against it. The guard systems were designed to meet more esoteric threats, and even after 10 years of slowly escalating guerrilla action, they still didn't really believe anyone would use his body to wage war. So we walked in and killed everybody there. The staff was a sentient tech clone of 10 and an executive foreman. No gnolls or zombies. The 10 identical technicians milled in panic. The foreman stared at us in disbelief and what I think was distaste that we'd gone so far outside the bounds of procedure. We killed them like you kill insects, not really thinking about it much, except for that part of you that always thinks about it, that records it and replays it while you sleep. Then we blew up the transmitter with chemical explosives. Then, as the flames leaped up and ate holes in the night, we'd gotten on our bicycles and rode like hell toward the Blackfriars, the mountains hunching and looming ahead, as jagged as black snaggleteeth against the industrial glare of the sky. A tanglefield had snatched at us for a second, but then we were gone. That's all that I personally had to do with the historic Battle of Dakota. It was enough. We'd paved the way for the whole encounter. Without the transmitter's energy, weapons, and transportation systems, including lift shafts, sidewalks, iris doors, and windows, heating, lighting, waste disposal, were inoperable. Dakota was immobilized. Without the station's broadcast matter, thousands of buildings, industrial complexes, roadways, and homes had collapsed into chaos, literally collapsed. More important, without broadcast nourishment, Dakota's 4 major cerebrums, handling an incredible complexity of military, industrial, administrative tasks, were knocked out of operation, along with a number of smaller cerebrums. The synapses need constant nourishment to function, and so do the sophont ganglion units, along with the constant flow of the psychocybernetic current to keep them from going mad from sensory deprivation. And even the gnolls would soon grow intractable as hunger stung them almost to self-awareness, finally to die after a few days. Any number of the lowest-ranking sentient clones, all those without stomachs or digestive systems, mostly in the military and industrial castes, would find themselves in the same position as the gnolls. Without broadcast nourishment, they would die within days. And without catarchs in operation to duplicate the function of atrophied intestines, the buildup of body wastes would poison them anyway, even if they could somehow get nourishment. The independent food dispensers for the smaller percentage of full sentience and higher clones simply could not increase their output enough to feed that many people, even if converted to intravenous systems, to say nothing of the zombies in the environments scattered throughout the city. There were backup fail-safe systems, of course, but they hadn't been used in centuries. The majority of them had fallen into disrepair and didn't work, and other Quaestor teams made sure the rest of them wouldn't work either. Before a shot had been fired, Dakota was already a major disaster. The Combine had reacted as we'd hoped, as they'd been additionally prompted to react by intelligence reports of Quaestor massings in strength around Dakota that it had taken weeks to leak to the Combine from unimpeachable sources. The Combine was pouring forces into Dakota within hours, nearly the full strength of the traditional military caste, and a large percentage of the militia they'd cobbled together out of industrial clones when the Quaestors had begun to get seriously troublesome, plus a major portion of their heavy armament. They had hoped to surprise the Quaestors, catch them between the city and the inaccessible portion of the Blackfriars, quarter the area with so much strength it'd be impossible to dodge them, run the Quaestors down, annihilate them, break the back of the movement. It had worked the other way around. For years, the Quaestors had stung and run, always retreating when the Combine advanced, never meeting them in conventional battle, never hitting them with anything really heavy. Then, when the Combine had risked practically all of its military resources on one gigantic effort calculated to be effective against the usual Quaestor behavior, we had suddenly switched tactics. The Quaestors had waited to meet the Combine's advance and had hit the Combine forces with everything they'd been able to save, steal, hoard, and buy clandestinely from sympathizers in the Commonwealth in over 15 years of conspiracy and campaign aimed at this moment. Within an hour of the first Taknuk exchange, the city had ceased to exist, everything leveled except 2 of the Cerebrums and the Escradal Krish. Then the Quaestors activated their terraforming devices, which I believe they bought from a firm here on Kos, as a matter of fact. This was completely insane. Terraforming systems used indiscriminately can destroy entire planets. But it was the insanity of desperation, and they did it anyway. Within a half hour, the remaining Combi heavy armaments battalions and the 2 Cerebrums ceased to exist. A few minutes later, the supposedly invulnerable Escradal Krish ceased to exist, the first time in history a Krish had ever been destroyed. Then, as the cycling energies got out of hand and filter feedback built to a climax, everything on the veldt ceased to exist. The carnage had been inconceivable. Take the vast population of Dakota as a base, the second largest city on world, one of the biggest even in this sector of the Commonwealth. The sub-fleets had been in, bringing the Betya harvest and other goods up the Delva. River traffic was always heaviest at that time of year. The mines and factories had been in full swing, and the giant sprawl of the Westerness shipyards and engine works. Add the swarming inhabitants of the 6 major controlled environments that circled the city. Add the city within a city of Admin South in charge of that atmosphere. Add the 20 generations of Dakota Combine full sentience whose discorporate ego patterns had been preserved in the mountain of indestructible micromolecular circuitry called the Escradal Krish. Those executives had died the irreversible true death, without hope of resurrection this time, even as disembodied intellects housed within artificial mind environments. The records of their brain's unique pattern of electrical, chemical, psychocybernetic rhythms and balances had been destroyed, and you can't rebuild consciousness from a fused puddle of slag. This hit the Combine where they lived, literally, and had more impact than anything else. Add the entire strength of both opposing forces. All of our men who suspected what would happen had been suicide volunteers. Add all of the elements together. The total goes up into the multiples of billions. The number was too big to grasp. Our minds fumbled at it while we marched and gave up. It was too big. I stared at Wren's back as we walked, a nearly invisible mannequin silhouette, and tried to multiply that out to the necessary figure. I staggered blindly along, lost and inundated beneath thousands of individual arms, legs, faces, a row of faces blurring off into infinity, all screaming, and the imagining nowhere near the actuality. Billions. How many restless ghosts out of that many deaders? Who do they haunt? Billions. Dawn caught us about 2 hours out. It came with no warning, as usual. We were groping through worlds ink-dark, moonless night, watched only by the million icy eyes of evening, shreds of witchfire crystal, incredibly cold and distant. I'd watched them night after night for years, scrawling their indecipherable hieroglyphics across the sky, indifferent to man's incomprehension. Now, as always, the night sky reminded me of a computer punch card, printed white on black. I stopped for a second on a rise, pushing back the infrared lenses, staring at the sky. What program was printed there? Suns for ciphers, worlds for decimal points? An absurd question. I was nearly as foolish as you once, Buck, but it was the first fully verbalized thought I'd had since I'd realized the nakedness of flesh back there on the parapet as my life tore itself apart. I asked it again, half expecting an answer, watching my breath turn to plumes and tatters, steaming in the silver chill of the stars. The sun came up like a meteor. It scuttled up from the horizon with that unsettling, deceptive speed that even natives of the world never quite get used to. New light washed around us, blue and raw at first, deepening the shadows and honing their edges. The sun continued to hitch itself up the sky, swallowing stars, a watery pink flush wiping the horizon clear of night. The light deepened, mellowed into gold. We floated through silver mist that swirled up around the mountain's knobby knees. I found myself crying silently as I walked the high ridge between mist and sky, absorbing the morning with a new hunger, grappling with a thought that was still too big for my mind and kept slipping elusively away, just out of reach. There was a low hum as our warm suits adjusted to the growing warmth, polarizing from black to white, bleeding heat back into the air. Down the flanks of the Blackfriars and away across the valley below, visible now as the mists pirouetted past us to the summits, the night plants were dying, shriveling visibly in mile-long swaths of decay. In seconds, the Blackfriars were gaunt and barren, turned to hills of ash and bone. The sun was now a bloated yellow disk surrounded by halos of red and deepening scarlet, shading into the frosty blue of rarefied air. Stripped of softening vegetation, the mountains looked rough and abrasive as pumice, gouged by lunar shadows. The first of the day plants began to appear at our feet, the green spiderwebbing poking up through cracks in the dry earth. We came across a new stream, tumbling from melting ice, sluicing a dusty gorge. An hour later, we found the valley. Hyneth led us down into the marshy plain that rolled away from mountains to horizon. We circled wide, cautiously approaching the valley from the lowlands. Hyneth held up his hand, pointed to me. Ren, Goth. The others fanned out across the mouth of the valley, hid, settled down to wait. We went in alone. The spear grass had grown rapidly. It was chest high. We crawled in, timing our movements to coincide with the long soughing of the morning breeze so that any rippling of the grass would be taken for natural movement. It took us about a half hour of dusty, sweaty work. When I judged that I'd wormed my way in close enough, I stopped, slowly parted the spear grass enough to peer out without raising my head. It was a large vac van, 500-footer, equipped with Waldos for self-loading. It was parked near the hill flank on the side of the wide valley. There were 3 men with it. I ducked back into the grass, paused to make sure my gun was ready for operation, then crawled laboriously nearer to the van. It was very near when I looked up again. About 25 feet away in the center of a cleared space, I could make out the hologram pictograph that pulsed identification on the side, the symbol for Urheim, world's largest city and combined seat of Bord, half a world away in the northern hemisphere. They'd come a long way, still thought of as long, though ships whispered between the stars. It was still long for feet and eyes, and another longer way, from fetuses in glass wombs to men stamping and jiggling with cold inside the fold of a mountain's thigh, watching the spreading morning. That made me feel funny to think about. I wondered if they suspected that it'd be the last morning they'd ever see. That made me feel funnier. The thought tickled my mind again, danced away. I checked my gun a second time, needlessly. I waited, feeling troubled, pushing it down. Two of them were standing together several feet in front of the van, sharing a mild narcotic atomizer, sucking deeply, shuffling with restlessness and cold, staring out across the spear grass to where the plain opened up. They had the stiff, rumpled, puff-eyed look of people who had just spent an uncomfortable night in a cramped place. They were dressed as full sentients, uncloned, junior officers of the military caste, probably hereditary positions inherited from their families, as is the case with most of the uncloned cadet executives. Except for the cadre at Urheim and other major cities, they must have been some of the few surviving Klansmen. Hundreds of thousands of military cadets and officers had died at Dakota, along with uncounted clones and semi-sentients of all ranks, and the caste had never been extremely large in the first place. The bylaws had demanded that the Combine maintain a security force, but it had become mostly traditional with minimum function, at least among the uncloned higher ranks, almost the last stronghold of old-fashioned nepotism. That was one of the things that had favored the Quaestor uprising and had forced the Combine to take the unpopular step of impressing large levies of industrial clones into a militia. The most junior of these two cadets was very young, even younger than me. The third remained inside the van's cab. I could see his face blurrily through the windfield, kept on against the cold, though the van was no longer in motion. I waited. I knew the others were maneuvering into position around me. I also knew what Heineth was waiting for. The third man jumped down from the high cab. He was older, wore an officer's hologram, a full executive. He said something to the cadets, moved a few feet toward the back of the van, started to take a piss. The column of golden liquid steamed in the cold air. Heineth whistled. I rolled to my knees, parted the spear grass at the edge of the cleared space, swung my gun up. The two cadets started, face muscles tensing into uncertain fear. The older cadet took an involuntary step forward, still clutching the atomizer. Wren and Goth chopped him down, firing a stream of bullets into him. The guns made a very loud metallic rattling sound that jarred the teeth, and fire flashed from the ejector ends. Birds screamed upward all along the mountain flank. The impact of the bullets knocked the cadet off his feet, rolled him so that he came to rest belly down. The atomizer flew through the air, hit, bounced. The younger cadet leaped toward the cab, right into my line of fire. I pulled the trigger. Bullets exploded out of the gun. The cadet was kicked backwards, arms swinging wide, slammed against the side of the cab, jerked upright as I continued to fire, spun along the van wall and rammed heavily into the ground. He tottered on one shoulder for a second, then flopped over on his back. At the sound of the first shot, the executive had whirled, penis still dangling from pantaloons, piss spraying wildly, and dodged for the back of the van so that Heineth's volley missed and screamed from the van wall, leaving a long scar. The executive dodged again, crouched, came up with a biodeath in one hand, and swung right into a single bullet from Wren just as he began to fire. The impact twirled him in a staggering circle, his finger still pressing the trigger. The carrier beam splashed harmlessly from the van wall, traversed as the executive spun, cut a long swath through the spear grass, the plants shriveling and blackening as the beam swept over them. Heineth opened up again before the beam could reach his clump of grass, sending the executive, somehow still on his feet, lurching past the end of the van. The biodeath dropped, went out. Heineth kept firing, the executive dancing bonelessly backwards on his heels, held up by the stream of bullets. Heineth released the trigger. The executive collapsed, a heap of arms and legs at impossible angles. When we came up to the van, the young cadet was still dying. His body shivered and arched, his heels drummed against the earth. His fingers plucked at nothing, and then he was still. There was a lot of blood. The others moved up from the valley mouth. Heineth sent them circling around the rim where the valley walls dipped on three sides. We dragged the bodies away and concealed them in some large rocks. I was feeling numb again, like I had after Dakota. I continued to feel numb as we spent the rest of the morning in frantic preparation. My mind was somehow detached as my body sweated and dug and hauled. There was a lot for it to do. We had 4 heavy industrial lasers, rock cutters. They were clumsy, bulky, inefficient things to use as weapons, but they'd have to do. This mission had not been planned so much as thrown together. Only 2 hours before the liaison man had contacted us on the parapet. Anything that could possibly work at all would have to be made to work somehow. No time to do it right, just do it. We'd been the closest team in contact with the field HQ who'd received the report, so we'd been snatched. The lasers were the only things on hand that could even approach potential as a heavy weapon, so we used the lasers. Now that we'd taken the van without someone alerting the Combine by radio from the cab, Heineth flashed a signal mirror back toward the shoulder of the mountain we'd quitted a few hours before. The liaison man swooped down 10 minutes later, carrying one of the lasers strapped awkwardly to his platvac. He made 3 more trips, depositing the massive cylinders as carefully as eggs, then gunned his platvac and screamed back toward the Blackfriars in a maniac arc just this side of suicidal. His face was still gray, tight-pressed lips a bloodless white against ash, and he hadn't said a word during the whole unloading procedure. I think he was probably one of the quaestors who followed the Way of Atonement. I never saw him again. I've sometimes wished I'd had the courage to follow his example, but I rationalized by telling myself that I have atoned with my life rather than my death, and who knows, it might even be somewhat true. It's nice to think so, anyway. It took us a couple of hours to get the lasers into position. We spotted them in 4 places around the valley walls, dug slanting pits into the slopes to conceal them, and tilt the barrels up at the right angle. The hardest thing was figuring out elevation and trajectory, but we finally got them all zeroed on a spot about 100 feet above the center of the valley floor, the muzzle arrangement giving each a few degrees of leeway on either side. That's where she'd have to come down anyway if she was a standard Orbot, the valley being just wide enough to contain the boat and the vac van, with a safety margin between them. Of course, if they brought her down on the plain outside the valley mouth, things were going to get very hairy. In that case, we might be able to lever 1 or 2 of the lasers around to bear. Or, failing that, we could try to take the Orbot on foot once it's landed, with about 1 chance in 8 to making it. But we thought that they'd land her in the valley. That's where the vac van had been parked, and they'd want the shelter of the high mountain walls to conceal the Orbot from any quaestor eyes that might be around. If so, that gave us a much better chance, about 1 out of 3. When the lasers had been positioned, we scattered, 4 men to an emplacement, hiding in the camouflage trenches alongside the big barrels. Heineth led Goth and me toward the laser we'd placed about 50 feet up the mountain flank, directly behind and above the vac van. Wren stayed behind. He stood next to the van, shoulders characteristically slouched, thumbs hooked in his belt, face carefully void to expression, and watched us out of sight. Then he looked out over the valley mouth, hitched up his gun, spat in the direction of Urheim, and climbed up into the van cab. The valley was empty again. From our positions, the vac van looked like a shiny toy, sundogs winking across its surface as it baked in the afternoon heat. An abandoned toy lost in high weeds, waiting in loneliness to be reclaimed by owners who would never come. Time passed. The birds we'd frightened away began to settle back onto the hillsides. I shifted position uneasily, trying half-heartedly to get comfortable. Hyneth glared me into immobility. We were crouched in a trench about 8 feet long and 5 feet deep, covered by a camouflage tarpaulin, propped open on the valley side by pegs, a couple of inches of vegetation, and topsoil on top of the tarpaulin. Hyneth was in the middle, straddling the operator's saddle of the laser. Goth was on his left, I was on his right. Hyneth was going to man the laser when the time came. It only took one person. There was nothing for Goth and me to do. Would be nothing to do even during the ambush, except take over the firing in the unlikely event that Hyneth was killed without the shot wiping out all of us, or stand by to lever the laser around in case that became necessary. Neither was very likely to happen. No, it was Hyneth's show, and we were superfluous and unoccupied. That was bad. We had a lot of time to think. That was worse. I was feeling increasingly numb, like a wall of clear glass had been slipped between me and the world and was slowly thickening, layer by layer. With the thickening came an incredible isolation. Isolation, though I was cramped and suffocating, though I was jammed up against Hyneth's bunched thigh. I couldn't touch him. He was miles away. And with the isolation came a sick, smothering panic. It was the inverse of claustrophobia. My flesh had turned to clear plastic, my bones to glass, and I was naked, ultimately naked, and there was nothing I could wrap me in. Surrounded by an army, I would still be alone, shrouded in iron 30 feet underground. I would still be naked. One portion of my mind wondered dispassionately if I were slipping into shock. The rest of it fought to keep down the scream that gathered along tightening muscles. The isolation increased. I was unaware of my surroundings, except for the heat and the pressure of enclosure. I was seeing the molten spider of Dakota, lying on its back and showing its obscene blotched belly, kicking legs of flame against the sky, each leg raising a poison blister where it touched the clouds. I was seeing the boy, face runneled by blood, beating heels against the ground. I was beginning to doubt big, simple ideas. Nothing moved in the valley except wind through grass, spirits circling in the form of birds, spider legs, crab dance. The blocky shadow of the vac van crept across the valley. Suddenly, with the intensity of vision, I was picturing Wren sitting in the van cab, shoulders resting against the door, legs stretched out along the seat, feet propped up on the instrument board, one ankle crossed over the other, gun resting across his lap, eyes watching the valley mouth through the windfield. He would be smoking a cigarette, and he would take it from his lips occasionally, flick the ashes onto the shiny dials with a fingernail, smile his strange smile, and carefully burn holes in the plush fabric of the upholstery. The fabric, real fabric, not plastic, would smolder, send out a wisp of bad-smelling smoke, and there would be another charred black hole in the seat. Wren would smile again, put the cigarette back in his mouth, lean back, and puff slowly. Wren was waiting to answer the radio signal from the orbit, to assure them that all was well, to talk them down to death. If they suspected anything was wrong, he would be the first to die. Even if everything went perfectly, he stood a high chance of dying anyway. He was the most exposed. It was almost certainly a suicide job. Wren said that he didn't give a shit. Maybe he actually didn't. Or at least he had convinced himself that he didn't. He was an odd man. Older than any of us, even Hyneth. He had worked most of his life as a cadet executive and admin at Erheim, devoted his existence to his job, subjugated all of his energies to it. He had been passed over 3 times for promotion to executive status, years of redoubled effort and mounting anxiety between each rejection. With the 3rd failure, he had been quietly retired to live on the credit subsidy he had earned with 40 years of service. The next morning, precisely at the start of his accustomed work period, he stole a biodeath from the security guard in the admin complex, walked into his flow sector, killed everyone there, and disappeared from Erheim. After a year on the run, he had managed to contact the Quaestors. After another year of training, he was serving with a commando team in spite of his age. That had been 5 years ago. I had known him for 2. During all that time, he had said little. He did his job very well with a minimum of waist motion, never made mistakes, never complained, never showed emotion. But occasionally he would smile and burn a hole in something or someone. The sun dived at the horizon, seeming to crash into the plain in an explosion of flame. Night swallowed us in one gulp, black as a beast's belly. It jerked me momentarily back into reality. I had a bad moment when I thought I'd gone blind, but then reason returned and I slipped the infrared lenses down over my eyes, activated them. The world came back in shades of gray. Heineth was working cramped legs against the body of the laser. He spoke briefly, and we gulped some stimulus pills to keep us awake. They were bitter and hard to swallow, dry as usual, but they kicked up a familiar acid churning in my stomach, and blood began to flow faster. I glanced at Heineth. He'd been quiet, even for Heineth. I wondered what he'd been thinking. He looked at me, perhaps reading the thought, and ordered us out of the trench. Goth and I crawled slowly out, feeling stiff and brittle, slapped our thighs and arms, stamped to restore circulation. Stars were sprinkling across the sky, salt spilled on black porcelain. I still couldn't read them, I found. The day plants had vanished. The day animals had retreated into catalepsy. The night plants were erupting from the ground, fed by the debris of the day plants. They grew rapidly, doubling, then tripling in height as we watched. They were predominantly thick, ropey shrubs with wide, spearhead leaves of dull purple and black about 4 feet high. Goth and I dug a number of them up, root systems intact, and placed them on top of the tarpaulin to replace the day plants that had shriveled with the first touch of bitter evening frost. We had to handle them with padded gloves. The leaf surfaces greedily absorbed the slightest amount of heat and burned like dry ice. Then we were back in the trench, and it was worse than ever. Motion had helped for a while, but I could feel the numbing panic creeping back, and the momentary relief made it even harder to bear. I tried to start a conversation, but it died in monosyllabic grunts, and silence sopped up the echoes. Heineth was methodically checking the laser controls for the nth time. He was tense. I could see it bunch his shoulder muscles, bulge his calves into rock as they pushed against the footplates of the saddle. Goth looked worse than I did. He was somewhat younger and usually energetic and cheerful. Not tonight. We should have talked, spread the pain around. I think all of us realized it, but we couldn't. We were made awkward by our own special intimacy. At one time or another, every one of us had reached a point where he had to talk or die. Even Heineth, even Wren. So we all had talked and all had listened, each of us switching roles sooner or later. We had poured our fears and dreams and secret memories upon each other, until now we knew each other too well. It made us afraid. Each of us was afraid that he had exposed too much, let down too many barriers. We were afraid of vulnerability, of the knife that jabs for the softest fold of the belly. We were all scarred men already and twice shy. And the resentment grew that others had seen us that helpless, that vulnerable. So the walls went back up, intensified. And so when we needed to talk again, we could not. We were already too close to risk further intimacy. Visions returned, ebbing and flowing, overlaying the darkness. The magma churning, belching a hot breath that stinks of rotten eggs. The cadet, his face inhuman in the death rictus, blood running down in a wash from his smashed forehead, plastering one eye closed, bubbling at his nostril, frothing around his lips, the lips tautening as his head jerks forward and then backwards, slamming the ground, the lips then growing slack, the body slumping, the mouth sagging open, the rush of blood and phlegm past the tombstone teeth, down the chin and neck, soaking into the fabric of the tunic, the feet drumming at the ground a final time, digging up clots of earth. I groped for understanding. I had killed people before, and it had not bothered me except in sleep. I had done it mechanically, routine backed by hate, hate cushioned by routine. I wondered if the night would ever end. I remembered the morning I'd watched from the mountain. I didn't think the night would end. A big idea tickled my mind again. The city swallowed by stone. The cadet falling, swinging his arms wide. Why always the cadet and the city in conjunction? Had one sensitized me to the other, and if so, which? I hesitated. Could both of them be equally important? One of the other section leaders whistled. We all started, somehow grew even more tense. The whistle came again, warbling, sound floating on silence like oil on water. Someone was coming. After a while, we heard a rustling and snapping of underbrush approaching downslope from the mountain. Whoever it was, he was making no effort to move quietly. In fact, he seemed to be blundering along, bowling through the tangles, making a tremendous thrashing noise. Goth and I turned in the direction of the sound, brought our guns up to bear, primed them. That was instinct. I wondered who could be coming down the mountain toward us. That was reason. Heineth twisted to cover the opposite direction, away from the noise, resting his gun on the saddle rim. That was caution. The thrasher passed our position about 6 feet away, screened by the shrubs. There was an open space 10 feet farther down at the head of a talus bluff that slanted to the valley. We watched it. The shrubs at the edge of the clearing shook, were torn aside. A figure stumbled out into starlight. It was a knoll. Goth sucked in a long breath, let it hiss out between his teeth. Heineth remained impassive, but I could imagine his eyes narrowing behind the thick lenses. My mind was totally blank for about 3 heartbeats, then surprised. A knoll! And I brought the gun barrel up, then uncomprehending. A knoll? And I lowered the muzzle. Blank for a second, then how? And trickling in again, how? Thoughts snarled into confusion. The gun muzzle wavered hesitantly. The knoll staggered across the clearing, weaving in slow figure eights. It almost fell down the talus bluff, one foot suspended uncertainly over the drop, then lurched away, goaded by tropism. The knoll shambled backward a few paces, stopped, swayed, then slowly sank to its knees. It kneeled, head bowed, arms limp along the ground, palms up. Heineth put his gun back in his lap, shook his head. He told us he'd be damned if he could figure out where it came from, but we'd have to get rid of it. It could spoil the ambush if it was spotted. Automatically, I raised my gun, trained it. Heineth stopped me. No noise, he said, not now. He told Goth to go out and kill it silently. Goth refused. Heineth stared at him speechlessly, then began to flush. Goth and Heineth had had trouble before. Goth was a good man, brave as a bull, but he was stubborn, tended to follow his own lead too much, and had too many streaks of sentimentality and touchiness. Thought too much to be a really efficient cog. They had disagreed from the beginning, something that wouldn't have been tolerated this long if the Quaestors hadn't been desperate for men. Goth was a devil in a fight when aroused, one of the best, and that had excused him a lot of obstinacy. But he had a curious squeamishness. He hadn't developed the layers of numbing scar tissue necessary for guerrilla work, and that was almost inevitably fatal. I'd wondered before, dispassionately, how long he would last. Goth was a hereditary, full sentient, one of the few connected with the Quaestors. He'd been a cadet executive in admin, gained access to old archives that had slowly soured him on the Combine, been hit at the psychologically right moment by increasing Quaestor agitprop, and had defected. After a 2-year proving period, he'd been allowed to participate actively. Goth was one of the only field people who was working out of idealism rather than hate, and that made us distrust him. Hyneth also nurtured a traditional dislike for hereditary full sentience. Hyneth had been part of an Industrial 6 clone for over 20 years before joining the Quaestors. His 6 had been wiped out in a production accident caused by standard Combine negligence. Hyneth had been the only survivor. The Combine had expressed mild sympathy and told him that they planned to cut another clone from him to replace the destroyed 6. He, of course, would be placed in charge of the new 6 by reason of his seniority. They smiled at him, not seeing any reason why he wouldn't want to work another 20 years with biological replicas of his dead brothers and sisters. The men, additionally, reminders of what he'd been as a youth, unravaged by years of pain. Hyneth had thanked them politely, walked out, and kept walking, crossing the Von Inks waste on foot to join the Quaestors. I could see all this working in Hyneth's face as he raged at Goth. Goth could feel the hate too, but he stood firm. The Knoll was incapable of doing anybody any harm. He wasn't going to kill it. There had been enough slaughter. Goth's face was bloodless, and I could see Dakota reflected in his eyes, but I felt no sympathy for him, in spite of my own recent agonies. He was disobeying orders. I thought about Mason, the man Goth had replaced, the man who had died in my arms at Ithaca, and I hated Goth for being alive instead of Mason. I had loved Mason. He'd been an antiquarian in the Urheim archives, and he'd worked for the Quaestors almost from the beginning. Years of vital service before his activities were discovered by the Combine. He'd escaped the raid, but his family hadn't. He'd been offered an admin job in Quaestor HQ, but had turned it down and insisted on field work, in spite of warnings that it was suicidal for a man of his age. Mason had been a tall, gentle, scholarly man who pretended to be gruff and hard-nosed, and cried alone at night when he thought nobody could see. I'd often thought that he could have escaped from Ithaca if he'd tried harder, but he'd been worn down, sick and guilt-ridden and tired, and his heart hadn't really been in it. That thought had returned to puzzle me often afterward. Mason had been the only person I'd ever cared about, the one who'd been more responsible than anybody for bringing me out of the shadows and into humanity, and I could have shot Goth at that moment because I thought he was betraying Mason's memory. Hyneth finally ran out of steam, spat at Goth, started to call him something, then stopped and merely glared at him, lips white. I'd caught Hyneth's quick glance at me, a nearly invisible head turn, just before he'd fallen silent. He'd almost forgotten and called Goth a zombie, a widespread expletive on world that had carefully not been used by the team since I'd joined. So Hyneth had never really forgotten, though he'd treated me with scrupulous fairness. My fury turned to a cold anger. widened out from goth to become a sick distaste for the entire world. Heineth told Goth he would take care of him later, take care of him good, and ordered me to go kill the gnoll, take him upslope and out of sight first, then conceal the body. Mechanically, I pulled myself out of the trench, started downslope toward the clearing. Anger fueled me for the first few feet, and I slashed the shrubs aside with padded gloves. But it ebbed quickly, leaving me hollow and numb. I'd known how the rest of the team must actually think of me, but somehow I'd never allowed myself to admit it. Now I'd had my face jammed in it, and coming on top of all the other anguish I'd gone through in the last 2 days, it was too much. I pushed into the clearing. My footsteps triggered some response in the gnoll. It surged drunkenly to its feet, arms swinging limply, and turned to face me. The gnoll was slightly taller than me, built very slender, and couldn't have weighed too much more than 100 pounds. It was bald, completely hairless. The fingers were shriveled, limp flesh dangling from the club of the hand never been used. The toes had been developed to enable technicians to walk gnolls from one section of the cerebrum to another, but the feet had never had a chance to toughen or grow callous. They were a mass of blood and lacerations. The nose was a rough blob of pink meat around the nostrils, the ears similarly atrophied. The eyes were enormous, huge, milky corneas and small pupils, like those of a nocturnal bird, adapted to the gloom of the cerebrum, and allowed to function to forestall sensory deprivation. They aren't cut into the psychocybernetic current, like the synapses or the ganglions. There were small, messy wounds on the temples, wrists, and spine base where electrodes had been torn loose. It had been shrouded in a pajama-like suit of non-conductive material, but that had been torn almost completely away. Only a few hanging tatters remaining. There were no sex organs. The flesh under the ribcage was curiously collapsed. No stomach or digestive tract. The body was covered with bruises, cuts, gashes, extensive swatches, sun-baked to second-degree burns. Other sections seriously frostbitten or marred by bad cold burns from the night shrubs. My awe grew, deepened into archetypical dread. It was from Dakota, there could be no doubt about it. Somehow it had survived the destruction of its cerebrum. Somehow it had walked through the boiling hell to the foothills. Somehow it had staggered up to and over the mountain shoulder. I doubted if there'd be any predilection in its actions. Probably it had just walked blindly away from the ruined cerebrum in a straight line and kept walking. Its actions with the Talus Bluff demonstrated that. Maybe earlier some dim instinct had helped it fumble its way around obstacles in its path, but now it was exhausted, baffled, stymied. It was miraculous that it had made it this far, and the agony it must have suffered on its way was inconceivable. I shivered, spooked. The short hairs bristled on the back of my neck. The gnoll lurched toward me. I whimpered and sprang backwards, nearly falling, swinging up the gun. The gnoll stopped, its head lolling, describing a slow semicircle. Its eyes were tracking curiously, and I doubted if it could focus on me at all. To it, I must have been a blur of darker gray. I tried to steady my ragged breathing. It couldn't hurt me. It was harmless, nearly dead anyway. Slowly, I lowered the gun, pried my fingers from the stock, slung the gun over my shoulder. I edged cautiously toward it. The gnoll swayed, but remained motionless. Below, I could see the vac van at the bottom of the bluff, a patch of dull gunmetal sheen. I stretched my hand out slowly. The gnoll didn't move. This close, I could see its gaunt ribs rising and falling with the effort of its ragged breathing. It was trembling, an occasional convulsive spasm shuddering along its frame. I was surprised that it didn't stink. Knolls were rumored to have a strong personal odor, at least according to the talk in field camps. Bullshit, like so much of my knowledge at that time. I watched it for a minute, fascinated, but my training told me I couldn't stand out here for long. We were too exposed. I took another step, reached out for it, hesitated. I didn't want to touch it. Swallowing my distaste, I selected a spot on its upper arm, free of burns or wounds, grabbed it firmly with one hand. The knoll jerked at the touch, but made no attempt to strike out or get away. I waited warily for a second, ready to turn my grip into a wrestling hold if it should try to attack. It remained still, but its flesh crawled under my fingers, and I shivered myself in reflex. Satisfied that the knoll would give me no trouble, I turned and began to force it upslope, pushing it ahead of me. It followed my shove without resistance, until we hit the first of the night shrubs. Then it staggered and made a mewing, inarticulate sound. The plants were burning it, sucking warmth out of its flesh, raising fresh welts, ugly where bits of skin had adhered to the shrubs. I shrugged, pushed it forward. It mewed and lurched again. I stopped. The knoll's eyes tracked in my direction, and it whimpered to itself in pain. I swore at myself for wasting time, but moved ahead to break a path for the knoll, dragging it along behind me. The branches slapped harmlessly at my warm suit as I bent them aside. Occasionally one would slip past and lash the knoll, making it flinch and whimper. But it was spared the brunt of it. I wondered vaguely at my motives for doing it. Why bother to spare someone, something, I correct nervously, pain when you're going to have to kill him? It. In a minute. What difference could it make? I shelved that and concentrated on the movements of my body. The knoll wasn't heavy, but it was not easy to drag it uphill either, especially as it'd stumble and go down every few yards, and I'd have to pull it back to its feet again. I was soon sweating, but I didn't care, as the action helped to occupy my mind, and I didn't want to have to face the numbness I could feel taking over again. We moved upslope until we were about 30 feet above the trench occupied by Hyneth and Goth. This looked like a good place. The shrubs were almost chest-high here, tall enough to hide the knoll's body from an aerial search. I stopped. The knoll bumped blindly into me, leaned against me, its breath coming in rasps next to my ear. I shivered in horror at the contact. Gooseflesh blossomed on my arms and legs, swept across my body. Some connection sent a memory whispering at my mind, but I ignored it under the threat of rising panic. I twisted my shoulder under the knoll's weight, threw it off. The knoll slid back downslope a few feet, almost fell, recovered. I watched it, panting. The memory returned, gnawing incessantly. This time, it got through. Mason, scrambling through the sea-washed rocks of Cape Ithaca toward the waiting ram sub, while the fire, sky-whipping behind, picked us out against the shadows. Mason, too slow and vaulting over a stone ridge, balancing too long on the razor edge in perfect silhouette against the night. Mason jerking upright as a fusser fired from the high clough puddled his spine, melted his flesh like wax. Mason tumbling down into my arms, almost driving me to my knees. Mason, already dead, heavy in my arms. Heavy in my arms. Mason torn away from me as a wave broke over us and deluged me in spume. Mason sinking from sight as Hyneth screamed for me to come on, and I fought my way through the chest-high surf to the ram sub. That's what supporting the knoll had reminded me of. Mason, heavy in my arms. Confusion and fear and nausea. How could the knoll make me think of Mason? Sick self-anger that my mind could compare Mason, gentle as the dream father I'd never had, to something as disgusting as the knoll. Anger, novud, trying to scrub out shame and guilt. I couldn't take it. I let it spill out onto the knoll. Growling, I sprang forward, shook it furiously until its head rattled and wobbled on its limp neck, grabbed it by the shoulders and hammered it to its knees. I yanked my knife out. The blade flamed suddenly in starlight. I wrapped my hand around its throat to tilt its head back. Its flesh was warm. A pulse throbbed under my palm. All at once, my anger was gone, leaving only nausea. I suddenly realized how cold the night was. Wind bit to the bone. It was looking at me. I suppose I'd been lucky. Orphans aren't as common as they once were, not in a society where reproduction has been relegated to the laboratory, but they still occur with fair regularity. I had been the son of an uncloned junior executive who'd run up an enormous credit debt, gone bankrupt, and been forced into insolvency. The Combine had cut a clone from him so that their man-hours would make up the bank discrepancy, burned out the higher levels of his brain, and put him in one of the non-sentient penal-controlled environments. His wife was also cloned, but avoided brain scrub and went back to work in a lower capacity in admin. I, as a baby, then became a ward of the state and was sent to one of the institutional environments. Imagine an endless series of low noises, repeating over and over again forever. No high or low spots. Everything level. Like that. That's the only way to describe the years in the environments. We were fed, we were kept warm, we worked on conveyor belts piecing together miniaturized equipment. We were put to sleep electronically. We woke with our fingers already busy in the monotonous, rhythmical motions that we couldn't remember learning, motions we had repeated 1,000,000 times a day since infancy. Once a day, we were fed a bar of food concentrates and vitamins. Occasionally, at carefully calculated intervals, we would be exercised to keep us muscle tone. After reaching puberty, we were occasionally masturbated by electric stimulation, the seed saved for sperm banks. The administrators of the environment were not cruel. We almost never saw them. Punishment was by machine shocks, never severe, very rarely needed. The executives had no need to be cruel. All they needed was We'd been taught at some early stage, probably by shock and stimulation, to put the proper part in the proper slot as the blocks of equipment passed in front of us. We had never been taught to talk, although an extremely limited language of several mood sounds had independently developed among us. The executives never spoke on the rare intervals when they came to check the machinery that regulated us. We had never been told who we were, where we were. We had never been told anything. We didn't care about any of these things. The concepts had never formed in our minds. We were only semi-conscious at best anyway. There was nothing but The executives weren't concerned with our spiritual development. There was no graduation from the environment. There was no place else for us to go in a rigidly stratified society. The Combine had discharged its obligation by keeping us alive in a place where we could even be minimally useful. Though our jobs were sinecures that could have been more efficiently performed by computer, they gave the expense of our survival a socially justifiable excuse. They put us comfortably in a pigeonhole. We were there for life. We would grow up from infancy, grow old, and die, bathed in The first real, separate, and distinct memory of my life is when the Quaestors raided the environment, when the wall of the assembly chamber suddenly glowed red, buckled, collapsed inward, when Mason pushed out of the smoke and debris cloud, gun at the ready, and walked slowly toward me. That's hindsight. At the time, it was only a sudden invasion of incomprehensible sounds and lights and shapes and colors. Too much to possibly comprehend, incredibly alien. It was the first discordant note ever struck in our lives. Shattering our world in an instant, plunging us into another dimension of existence. The Quaestors kidnapped all of us, loaded us onto vac vans, took us into the hills, tried to undo some of the harm. That had been 6 years ago. Even with the facilities available at the Quaestor Underground complex, hypno-trainers and analysis computers to plunge me back to childhood and patiently lead me out again, step by step for 10,000 years of subjective time, while my body slumbered in stasis. Even with all that, I'd been lucky to emerge somewhat sane. The majority had died or been driven into catalepsy. I'd been lucky even to be a ward of the state, the way things had turned out. Lucky to be a zombie. I could have been a low-ranked clone without a digestive system, tied forever to the Combine by unbreakable strings. Or I could have been one of the thousands of tank-grown creatures whose brains are used as organic computer storage banks in the cerebrum gestalts, completely unsentient. I could have been a null. Enormous eyes staring at me, unblinking, warmth under my fingers. I wondered if I was going to throw up. Wind moaned steadily through the valley with a sound like Hyneth hissed for me to hurry up. Sound riding the wind, barely audible. I shifted my grip on the knife. I was telling myself it's never been really sentient anyway. Its brain has only been used as a computer unit for a biological gestalt. There's no individual intelligence in there. It wouldn't make any difference. I was telling myself, it's dying anyway from a dozen causes. It's in pain. It would be kinder to kill it. I brought up the knife, placing it against the gnoll's throat. I pressed the point in slowly until it was pricking flesh. The gnoll's eyes tracked, focused on the knife blade. My stomach turned over. I looked away out across the valley. I felt my carefully created world trembling and blurring around me. I felt again on the point of being catapulted into another level of comprehension, previously unexpected. I was afraid. The vac van's headlights flashed on and off, twice. I found myself on the ground, hidden by the ropey shrubs. I had dragged the gnoll down with me without thinking about it, pinned him flat to the ground, arm over back. That had been the signal that Wren had received a call from the Orbot, had given it the proper radio code reply to bring it down. I could imagine him grinning in the darkened cab as he worked the instruments. I raised myself on an elbow, jerked the knife up, suspending it while I looked for the junction of spine and neck that would be the best place to strike. If I was going to kill him, I would have to kill him, now. In quick succession, like a series of slides, like a computer equation running, I got Dakota, the cadet, Mason, the gnoll. It and him tumbled in selection. Came up, him. I lowered the knife. I couldn't do it. He was human. Everybody was. For better or worse, I was changed. I was no longer the same person. I looked up. Somewhere up there, hanging at the edge of the atmosphere, was the tinsel collection of forces in opposition called a starship, delicately invulnerable as an iron butterfly. It would be phasing in and out of reality to hold its position above world, maintaining only the most tenuous of contacts with this continuum. It had launched an Orbot, headed for a rendezvous with the vac van in this valley. The Orbot was filled with the gene cultures that could be used to create hundreds of thousands of non-sentient clones who could be imprinted with behavior patterns and turned into computer-directed soldiers. Crude, but effective. The Orbot was filled with millions of tiny metal blocks kept under enormous compression. When released from tension, molecular memory would reshape them into a wide range of weapons needing only a power source to be functional. The Orbot was carrying, in effect, a vast army and its combat equipment in a form that could be transported in a 500-foot vac van and slipped into Urheim, where there were machines that could put it into use. It was the Combine's last chance, the second wind they needed in order to survive. It had been financed and arranged by various industrial firms in the Commonwealth who had vested interests in the Combine's survival on World. The Orbot's cargo had been assembled and sent off before Dakota, when it had been calculated that the reinforcements would be significant in ensuring a Combine victory. Now it was indispensable. Dakota had made the Combine afraid that an attack on Urheim might be next, that the Orbot might be intercepted by the Quaestors if the city was under siege when it tried to land. So the Combine had decided to land the Orbot elsewhere and sneak the cargo in. The Blackfriars had been selected as a rendezvous since it was unlikely the Quaestors would be on the alert for Combine activity in that area so soon after Dakota, and even if it stopped, the van might be taken for fleeing survivors and ignored. The starship had been contacted by Esper en route, and the change in plan made. 4 men had died to learn of the original plan. 2 more had died in order to learn of the new landing site and get the information to the Quaestors in time. The Orbot came down. I watched it, as in a dream, coming to my knees, head above the shrubs. The knoll stirred under my hand, pushed against the ground, sat up. The Orbot was a speck, a dot, a ball, a toy. It was gliding silently in on gravs, directly overhead. I could imagine Hyneth readying the laser, Goth looking up and chewing his lip the way he always did in stress. I knew that my place should be with them, but I couldn't move. Fear and tension were still there, but they were under glass. I was already emotionally drained. I could sum up nothing else, even to face death. The Orbot had swelled into a huge spherical mountain. It continued to settle toward the spot where we'd calculated it must land. Now it hung just over the valley center, nearly brushing the mountain walls on either side. The Orbot filled the sky, and I leaned away from it instinctively. It dropped lower. Hyneth was the first to fire. An intense beam of light erupted from the ground downslope, stabbed into the side of the Orbot. Another followed from the opposite side of the valley, then the remaining 2 at once. The Orbot hung, transfixed by 4 steady, unbearably bright columns. For a while it seemed as if nothing was happening. I could imagine the consternation aboard the Orbot as the pilot tried to reverse gravs in time. The boat's hull had become cherry red in 4 widening spots. Slowly the spots turned white. I could hear the knoll getting up beside me, near enough to touch. I had risen automatically, shading eyes against glare. The Orbot exploded. The reactor didn't go, of course. They're built so that can't happen. It was just the conventional auxiliary engines used for steering and for powering internal systems, but that was enough. Imagine a building humping itself into a giant stone fist and bringing that fist down on you. Squash. Pain so intense that it snuffs your consciousness before you can feel it. Warned by instinct, I had time to do 2 things. I thought distinctly, so night will never end. And I stepped in front of the knoll to shield him. Then I was kicked into oblivion. I awoke briefly to agony, whirled a solid blank red. Very, very far away, I could hear someone screaming. It was me. I awoke again. The pain had lessened. I could see. It was day, and the night plants had died. The sun was dazzling on bare rock. The knoll was standing over me, seeming to stretch up for miles into the sky. I screamed in preternatural terror. The world vanished. The next time I opened my eyes, the sky was heavily overcast and it was raining, one of those torrential southern downpours. A Quaestor medic was doing something to my legs, and there was a platvac nearby. The knoll was lying on his back a few feet away, a bullet in his chest. His head was tilted up toward the scuttling gray clouds. His eyes mirrored the rain. That's what happened to my leg. So much nerve tissue destroyed that they couldn't grow me a new one, and I had to put up with this stiff prosthetic, but I got used to it. I considered it my tuition fee. I'd learned two things: that everybody is human and that the universe doesn't care one way or the other. Only people do. The universe just doesn't give a damn. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that a relief? It isn't out to get you, and it isn't going to help you either. You're on your own. We all are, and we all have to answer to ourselves. We make our own heavens and hells. We can't pass the buck any further. How much easier when we could blame our guilt or goodness on God. Oh, I could read supernatural significance into it all. That I was spared because I'd spared the knoll. That some benevolent force was rewarding me. But what about Goth? Killed, and if he hadn't balked in the first place, the knoll wouldn't have stayed alive long enough for me to be entangled. What about the other team members? All dead. Wasn't there a man among them as good as me and as much worth saving? No, there's a more direct reason why I survived. Prompted by the knowledge of his humanity, I had shielded him from the explosion. 3 other men survived the explosion, but they died from exposure in the hours before the med team got there, baked to death by the sun. I didn't die because the knoll stood over me during the hours when the sun was rising and frying the rocks, and his shadow shielded me from the sun. I'm not saying that he consciously figured that out, deliberately shielded me, though who knows, but I had given him the only warmth he'd known in a long nightmare of pain, and so he remained by me when there was nothing stopping him from running away, and it came to the same result. You don't need intelligence or words to respond to empathy. It can be communicated through the touch of fingers. You know that if you've ever had a pet, ever been in love. So that's why I was spared. Warmth for warmth. The same reason anything good ever happens in this life. When the med team arrived, they shot the knoll down because they thought it was trying to harm me. So much for supernatural rewards for the just. So, empathy's the thing that binds life together. It's the flame we share against fear. Warmth's the only answer to the old, cold questions. So I went through life, boy. Made mistakes, did a lot of things, got kicked around a lot more, loved a little, and ended up on Kos, waiting for evening. But night's a relative thing. It always ends. It does, because even if you're not around to watch it, the sun always comes up and someone will be there to see. It's a fine, beautiful morning. It's always a beautiful morning somewhere, even on the day you die. You're young. That doesn't comfort you yet, but you'll learn.